Medovik. Medovik is a famous honey cake from Eastern Europe with roots tied to old Russian history and later to everyday life across the Soviet Union. The most popular legend credits its creation to the imperial court of Tsar Alexander in the early 1800s, where a new royal chef reportedly baked a honey-layered dessert without knowing that Empress Elizabeth had a strong dislike of honey in her food. She tried it, loved it, and the recipe spread. The cake became deeply embedded in Russian homemade cooking, and during the Soviet years, the cake became extremely popular because ingredients like honey and cream were easier for ordinary families to get. The cake itself is built from a stack of thin, crisp honey-spiced layers, anywhere from 6 to 10 of them, sandwiched together with a generous amount of sour cream frosting. One of the most unusual things about it is how its texture changes over time. When freshly assembled, Medovik is almost crunchy and firm, but as it rests in the refrigerator overnight, the sour cream seeps into each layer, softening the whole structure until the whole cake becomes very soft and tender. The result is a cake that almost melts when you eat it, with a faint tang from the cream and a deep caramel-like sweetness from the baked honey. The outside is typically covered in fine crumbs made from trimming the edges of the baked layers, giving it a rough, earthy appearance that contrasts nicely with how delicate the inside actually is. New York cheesecake. Unlike the lighter, airier cheesecakes found across Europe, the New York version is deliberately dense, rich, and almost custardy in its consistency. The key ingredient driving that texture is a lot of cream cheese. The style as we know it today is largely attributed to Arnold Rubin, the German-born restaurateur who opened a string of delis and restaurants in New York in the early 20th century. Rubin claimed he tasted a cheese pie at a dinner party and spent years refining what would become the iconic version, leaning heavily on cream cheese, rather than the cottage or farmer's cheese used in older recipes. The base is built on a pressed graham cracker crust, which provides a slightly sweet, crumbly contrast to the filling above it. Cream cheese, eggs, sugar, and vanilla are beaten together until completely smooth, then bake low and slow, often in a water bath to keep the heat even and prevent cracking. The top should be pale, smooth, and just barely set when it comes out of the oven. As it cools, the interior firms into something between a custard and a mousse, with a richness that coats the palate. There's no flavoring beyond vanilla and sometimes a touch of lemon, and no whipped cream topping in the original version. The point is the pure dairy weight of the cake. Jewish delicatessens across Manhattan popularized it through the mid-20th century, and places like Junior's in Brooklyn have been serving essentially the same recipe since 1950. The flavor is rich and sweet, but also slightly tangy from the cream cheese, which keeps it from tasting too heavy. Today, many versions come with strawberries, chocolate, or caramel on top, but many people believe a true New York cheesecake should be served plain so the creamy flavor stands out on its own. Lapis legit. Lapis legit is an Indonesian spice layer cake with roots that go back to Dutch colonial rule in the East Indies. The Dutch brought European baking practices with them to Indonesia, and Dutch families living in the area started mixing in local spices that were extremely valuable at the time. The cake became packed with flavors like cinnamon, cloves, and star anise, giving it a warm and rich smell that makes it stand out from normal cakes. Because it takes so much time and money to make, lapis legit is usually saved for important celebrations like Christmas, Eid, or Lunar New Year. It's also seen as a fancy gift because making all the layers takes a lot of patience and skill. Each layer, sometimes 30 or more, is baked individually under a broiler before the next one is poured and pressed on top. The process can take several hours from start to finish. The texture is incredibly dense and moist, almost more like a firm pâté in structure than a conventional cake. Each mouthful carries the warmth of all those spices against a backdrop of deeply buttery richness. Egg yolks make up a significant portion of the batter, sometimes 20 or more per cake, which contributes both to the color and the cake's almost waxy, fudge-like consistency. Queen-Amande. Queen-Amande is a rich buttery pastry from the Brittany region of France that many people consider one of the most buttery desserts in the world. Its name simply means butter cake in the Breton language. It was invented in 1860 by a baker named Yves René Scordia in the town of Douarnenez. According to local stories, it was created almost by accident during a time when flour was hard to get, but butter and sugar were everywhere. Scordia tried to save a batch of bread dough that did not rise properly by folding huge amounts of salted butter and sugar into it, kind of like the method used for flaky pastries. When he baked it, the outside turned dark, crispy, and caramelized, while the inside stayed soft and full of flaky layers. People loved it immediately, and it quickly became one of Brittany's most famous foods. A traditional Queen-Amande follows a very heavy recipe made of about 40% dough, 30% butter, and 30% sugar. While baking, the sugar melts and turns into a crunchy caramel shell, while steam from the butter pushes apart the layers of dough. The result is a flaky, sweet, and extremely rich pastry. Originally, it was baked as one large round cake meant to be shared with the family, but many bakeries today make smaller personal versions. The town of Douarnenez is very proud of the pastry and even has a group dedicated to protecting the traditional way of making it. In recent years, Queen Amande became popular around the world after appearing on baking shows like the Great British Bake Off. Raindrop cake. Mizu shingen mochi, commonly translated as raindrop cake, is a Japanese confection made primarily from water and agar, a plant-based gelling agent derived from seaweed. The result is a near-perfectly transparent sphere that resembles a giant water droplet, almost completely clear and light on flavor. It was developed by Kinseiken Seika, a confectionery shop in Yamanashi Prefecture, and introduced around 2014. The concept was deliberately minimal. The water used comes from the snowmelt of the Japanese Alps, which is soft and clean in a way that actually contributes to the taste. The sugar content is kept extremely low, so the natural quality of the water stays perceptible. Traditionally, it's served with a drizzle of kurumitsu, which is a dark sugar syrup made from blackstrap-style cane sugar, and a dusting of kinako, which is roasted soybean flour. Those two accompaniments are what give it any real substance in terms of flavor. The mochi itself contributes almost nothing beyond a faint sweetness and a cool texture that disappears on the tongue within seconds. Kinseiken even advises eating it within 30 minutes of being made, after which it begins to lose its shape and collapse back into liquid. That fragility became part of its appeal. When photos circulated on social media around 2016, the cake went viral internationally and was quickly replicated by bakeries in New York and across Europe. The versions produced outside Japan often use tap water and powdered gelatin instead of agar, which changes both the texture and taste. Baumkuchen. Baumkuchen is a kind of spit cake from the German cuisine whose name translates to tree cake. When sliced, the interior reveals concentric rings of golden batter, one for each layer built up during baking, so the cut surface looks a lot like the rings you see inside a tree trunk. The traditional preparation method is unlike any conventional cake baking. A thin layer of batter is brushed or poured onto a rotating horizontal spit, then held in front of open heat until it sets and browns slightly. Another layer goes on top, then another, with each pass of the spit building the cake thicker. A finished Baumkuchen might have 20 or 30 layers, and the process can take well over an hour. The recipe is simple, but the execution requires specialized equipment and skill. Eggs, butter, sugar, flour, and often marzipan make up the base, producing something that is dense, moist, and almost nutty in its sweetness. The exterior gets a finishing coat of chocolate or fondant glaze in many versions, and the cake has been documented in Germany since at least the 15th century, and it became closely associated with festive occasions and weddings, partly because of the time and effort involved in making it correctly. What is perhaps less expected is the cake's huge popularity in Japan. German missionaries and traders brought it to Japan in the earliest 20th century, and it was adapted and refined by Japanese confectioners to the point where it's now a fixture in Japanese patisseries and department store food halls. The Japanese version tends to be softer and more delicate than the German original, and regional variations with matcha, black sesame, and cherry blossom have made it distinctly Japanese in character while keeping its ring structure intact. Princess cake. Sweden's princess cake is immediately recognized by its domed surface of pale green marzipan. The interior is a more colorful affair. Layers of sponge cake are stacked with pastry cream, fresh raspberries or raspberry jam, and a deep layer of loosely whipped cream before the marzipan cover is draped over the whole dome and smoothed down. The cream filling is responsible for the rounded top, pushed upward by the generous amount packed inside, and slicing through reveals the cross-section all at once. The cake was created in the 1920s by Jenny Åkerström, a home economics teacher who wrote a cookbook series and was responsible for educating the daughters of Prince Carl, Duke of Västergötland. The book included a recipe for what was initially called grön tårta, or green cake, which the royal princesses were apparently fond of. Their enthusiasm gave it the name that stuck. It became a Swedish institution, and today is so embedded in the culture that the third week of September is officially designated as Princess Cake Week in Sweden, during which bakeries compete for the best version and sales spike noticeably across the country. The marzipan covering is functional as well as decorative. It acts as a kind of seal, keeping the cream and filling intact and slowing moisture loss, which means the cake holds its structure better than a cream-covered dessert normally would. The mix of almond-sweet marzipan, rich cream, and tart raspberry is carefully balanced, making it more interesting than it looks at first. Svoof. Sfouf is a Lebanese turmeric cake with a deep, vivid yellow color due to the generous amounts of ground turmeric blended into the batter. The flavor turmeric contributes here is mild and earthy rather than sharp or medicinal. Combined with anise seed, which is often toasted before added, the cake has a warm, gentle herbal quality that is unusual for a sweet. It's not layered, not filled, and contains no eggs. The batter is made from semolina or a blend of semolina and flour, sugar, tahini, oil, baking powder, and milk or plant-based milk, mixed together and poured into a pan. Pine nuts or sesame seeds are pressed onto the top before baking. It's a dense, slightly crumbly cake with a dryish texture that falls somewhere between a traditional Western cake and a pressed shortbread in structure. Sfouf is not particularly sweet, at least not by the standards of most other desserts, which makes it work well with coffee or tea as it does as an after-dinner finish. In Lebanon, it's traditionally made for school celebrations, spring gatherings, and informal visits. The name itself comes from the Arabic word for rose, referring to the way the cake is traditionally sliced into neat squares or diamonds in the baking pan. During Lent, it became popular because it contains no butter or eggs, making it compatible with fasting restrictions observed by Lebanese Christians. The tahini in the batter is what adds the richness that the absent butter would otherwise provide, giving it a subtle nuttiness and keeping the crumb moist. Tres leches. Tres leches is a sponge cake soaked in a mixture of 3 different dairy products: evaporated milk, sweetened condensed milk, and heavy cream. The origins of all the cakes are disputed across Latin America, with Mexico, Nicaragua, and Cuba all staking reasonably historical claims. What is fairly clear is that the recipe gained wide visibility in the mid-20th century, partly because the Nestle company printed a version of it on their condensed milk cans distributed throughout Latin America, which made the ingredients and the method accessible to millions of households at once. Whether Nestle created the recipe or simply popularized an existing one remains unclear. The method is straightforward. A light egg white sponge is baked until springy, then pierced all over and drenched into the combined 3-milk mixture, which seeps slowly into every part of the crumb. The cake is then chilled for several hours, during which the dairy soaks all the way through. When cut, the interior is wet, almost custard-like, but still holds its shape because the original sponge structure is intact. The topping is typically a thick layer of whipped cream, sometimes lightly sweetened, and often decorated with cinnamon or fresh fruit. What makes tres leches appealing is the contrast between the airy sponge and the concentrated dairy richness it carries. Each bite is simultaneously light and deeply indulgent. It's common across Mexican and Central American restaurants worldwide and exists in dozens of regional interpretations. Saint-Honoré cake. Saint-Honoré cake is named after the patron saint of bakers and pastry chefs, Saint Honoré of Amiens, and it's one of the most structurally complex things in French patisserie. The base is a disc of pâte brisée, a short crust-style dough topped with a ring of puff pastry piped around the edge. On top of that ring sit a series of small cream puffs that have been dipped in caramel, which hardens and tethers them in place. The center is filled with a cloud of chantilly cream, and traditionally with chibouste cream, which is a pastry cream lightened with meringue and named after the Paris pastry shop that invented the cake in the 1840s. Chibouste, the shop's founder, is credited with creating the original version around 1847, and over time, the recipe evolved through various French pastry traditions into the form it holds today. The short crust is crumbly and buttery, the puff pastry base is light and flaky, the choux puffs have a thin crisp shell and a soft interior, and the cream filling is cool and airy. Every component is made separately and assembled to order, which is why it's rarely attempted outside a professional setting. The caramel coating on the choux puff softens after a few hours, which means the window for serving the cake at its peak is narrow. In French patisseries, it tends to be made in individual portions as often as it's made in the large traditional format. Kladdkaka. Kladdkaka is Swedish for sticky cake. It's a Swedish chocolate cake that is intentionally underbaked, leaving the center gooey, dense, and intensely fudgy. The batter is simple: butter, eggs, sugar, cocoa powder, flour, and vanilla. No leavening agent. The mixture is thick, almost brownie-like in consistency before it goes into the oven, and it's baked just long enough for the outside to form a thin, lightly crisp crust while the center remains liquid. The origin of kladdkaka as a distinct Swedish cake is generally traced to the 1980s, when Swedish food magazines began publishing recipes for it. It spread quickly because it's fast, forgiving about precise measurement, requires no special equipment, and produces a result that satisfies a chocolate craving more completely than more elaborate preparations. It became a go-to bake for anyone in Sweden who needs to bring something to a gathering on short notice. It's served warm with a spoonful of whipped cream or vanilla ice cream that melts slightly from the residual heat. Some versions add espresso powder to deepen the chocolate character, and others incorporate cardamom. which works well given that Sweden's baking tradition has a long-standing affection for the spice. Ube cake. Ube is a purple yam native to the Philippines, with a vivid violet color which is popular in Filipino baking. Ube cake, in its most recognizable form, is a chiffon or sponge cake built from ube halaya, which is a slow-cooked sweetened yam paste used as both a flavoring agent and a filling. The flavor is distinct from regular sweet potato or purple sweet potato, with a mild nuttiness, a faint vanilla-like quality, and an almost floral sweetness that is gentle rather than cloying. The purple can range from lilac to deep violet depending on how much ube is used and how it's processed. In the Philippines, ube cake is a big part of celebrations like birthdays, weddings, and family gatherings. Purple yam has been used in Filipino desserts for centuries, long before it became part of modern cakes. Over time, local bakers combined traditional Filipino ingredients with Western-style baking to create ube cakes that are popular today. One of the best-known versions is ube coconut cake, which has layers of purple cake filled with sweet purple yam and topped with soft strips of preserved coconut. Espion cake. The Espion cake is a modern French dessert created by the famous pastry chef Pierre Hermé, often called the Picasso of pastry because of the unusual flavors he combines. The dessert mixes three main flavors: rose, raspberry, and lychee. Its name comes from the city of Isfahan in Iran, a place known for its beautiful gardens and fragrant roses. Pierre Hermé came up with the idea in the 1980s while working in Paris, where he wanted to turn the classic macaroon into something more rich and elegant. He spent months adjusting the flavors until they balanced perfectly. The most famous version of the Espion uses two large pink macaroons flavored with rose. Inside are fresh raspberries, rose cream, and sweet lychee fruit. It's designed to look beautiful, usually topped with a rose petal and a shiny drop of syrup. The taste is sweet, floral, fruity, and slightly tart. Since it was introduced, the Espion flavor combination has been used in many other desserts like croissants, ice cream, and large celebration cakes. Today, it's seen as one of the most famous luxury desserts in modern pastry. Tiramisu. Tiramisu is an Italian dessert built from ladyfinger biscuits soaked in strong espresso, layered with a mascarpone and egg mixture, and finished with a thick dusting of cocoa powder. The name translates loosely as pick me up or lift me up, a reference to the caffeine and sugar content. Tiramisu is a relatively young invention. The most credible origin story places it at the restaurant La Beccheria in Treviso, in the Veneto region of Italy, where pastry chef Roberto Linguinato and owner Ada Campiol developed it in the early 1970s. This origin is contested, as several other Italian establishments have made their own claims, but Treviso is widely accepted as the most likely birthplace. The filling is made by beating egg yolks with sugar until pale and thick, then folding in softened mascarpone and, in many traditional versions, whipped egg whites to add lightness. The ladyfingers are dipped briefly in espresso, sometimes with a splash of marsala wine or coffee liquor, and laid in a dish before the mascarpone layer is spread over them. The process is repeated, ending with a final cream layer and the cocoa dusting. The slight bitterness in the cocoa offsets the richness of the mascarpone. Properly made tiramisu needs several hours of refrigeration to let the cream firm and the biscuit soften completely into the filling. The result should be sliceable, but just barely, holding its layers when cut but barely stable. Tiramisu spread globally during the 1980s and 90s, becoming one of the most recognized Italian exports in the food world, and has countless adaptations that swap the coffee for fruit, matcha, or other flavors. Black Forest Gâteau. Black Forest cake is a rich chocolate and cream cake from the Black Forest area in southwest Germany. It's made with layers of dark chocolate cake, lots of whipped cream, and sour cherries that are usually soaked in a cherry liquor made from local cherries. In Europe, the cake officially cannot be called Black Forest cake unless it includes this cherry liquor. The exact origin of the cake is still debated, but most people credit a pastry chef named Josef Keller, who supposedly created it in 1915 while working at a cafe near the German city of Bonn. One of the most interesting things about the cake is that it looks like it may have been inspired by traditional clothing from the Black Forest region. The outfit had black fabric, white shirts, and bright red pom-poms on the hats, similar to the cake's dark chocolate, white cream, and red cherries. During the 20th century, the cake spread around the world as German immigrants shared the recipe, and today it's a bakery classic almost everywhere. Croquembouche. A croquembouche is a French celebration cake built from a tower of choux pastry puffs stacked into a cone shape and held together with threads of spun caramel. The name means crunch in the mouth in French. It's a traditional centerpiece of French weddings and First Communion celebrations, and it serves the same ceremonial function that a tiered wedding cake does in other cultures. A properly constructed croquembouche at a large gathering can stand 50 centimeters tall or more, draped in a web of golden sugar threads that catch the light. The base is usually a disc of nougat or almond pastry, and each individual choux puff is filled with pastry cream before being dipped in caramel and set in place. Edible decorations like candied almonds, sugar flowers, dragées, and ribbon are added as finishing details. Serving this cake requires breaking apart the structure, pulling the caramel-bonded puffs away from the cone. The challenge is that the spun sugar decorations and caramel bonds begin to soften and collapse if the humidity is high or if too much time passes before serving, which makes it a high-stakes preparation even for experienced pastry cooks. Battenberg cake. Battenberg cake is a classic British tea time dessert known for its colorful checkerboard pattern and thick layer of sweet almond marzipan. When you cut into it, you see 4 squares of pink and yellow sponge cake stuck together with apricot jam. According to popular legend, the cake was first made in 1884 to celebrate the marriage of Princess Victoria to Prince Louis of Battenberg. The 4 squares were said to represent the 4 Battenberg princes, although older versions of the cake actually had 9 squares before the simpler design became more common. The cake was inspired by German-style baking, reflecting the Battenberg family's German roots during a time when Britain and Germany had close royal connections. During World War I, anti-German feeling in Britain became very strong, so the family changed their name to Mountbatten, but the cake kept its original name. Its flavor is simple but comforting, combining soft buttery sponge with the sweet nutty taste of marzipan. For more than a century, it stayed a popular choice in British bakeries and tea rooms, where some people also call it a church window cake because of its pattern. Bienenstich. Bienenstich is a German cake whose name translates directly to bee sting. One story attributes it to the 15th century, when bakers from the German town of Andernach supposedly pelted attackers from a neighboring town with beehives, repelled the raid, and baked a honey cake to celebrate. Whether that story is true or not, the cake still fits the name because of its topping made from honey and almonds. It turns golden brown, sticky, and crunchy, almost like something bees would make themselves. The cake underneath is made from a soft yeast dough with butter and eggs. The texture is somewhere between sweet bread and a soft bun. It's lighter and chewier than a normal sponge cake, with a mild sweetness in the dough itself. On top goes a mix of butter, honey, sugar, and sliced almonds, cooked together until thick and shiny before spread over the dough. While baking, the topping caramelizes into a crisp golden layer that cracks when sliced. After cooling, the cake is usually cut in half and filled with a thick layer of vanilla cream, and depending on the bakery, this can be custard cream, light cream, or whipped cream mixed with pudding. One of the most unique parts is the texture contrast. The top is crunchy, the bread-like cake is soft and fluffy, and the cream filling is cool and smooth. Different versions exist across Germany. Some skip the filling completely, while others use different types of cream.